the best sustainability communicators don't have to say sustainability, don't have to say climate.
Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Stainthorpe. This podcast is brought to you by Northstar Carbon and Impact, the carbon and sustainability management platform built by sustainability professionals for sustainability professionals. Northstar helps companies simplify GHG accounting, improve data quality, and stay audit ready across scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions so teams can spend less time reporting and more time driving real impact. Today, I'm joined by Mike Hauer, founder of Hauer Impact and one of the leading voices in corporate sustainability communication. Mike has spent more than a decade as a journalist covering sustainability for GreenBiz, Sustainable Brands, and Triple Pundit, then moved into communication strategy, advising Fortune 500 companies at Edelman and beyond before founding Hauer Impact in 2023. His clients have included Mars, HP, Berry Global, and many others, helping them translate complex sustainability strategies into credible, compelling stories. He also hosts the Sustainability Communicator podcast, writes the Engaged newsletter, and just published his first book, Sustainability Storytelling. Today, we're taking the challenge of communication from a different angle than Mike usually explores on his show. In this episode, we unpack how to communicate technical sustainability topics both internally within a company and externally to the public, and anchor communication in principles that you can apply to make your carbon accounting claims compelling, relatable, and authentic, so you can highlight positive efforts while acknowledging challenges and uncertainties and not have that detract from forward momentum. Mike is working on scrutinizing corporate claims and as a strategist helping companies make them. That dual perspective is exactly what this conversation needs. Let's dive in. Mike, thanks for joining me today. In your career, you've worked as a reporter scrutinizing corporate sustainability claims and also worked to help companies communicate sustainability credibly. How does that experience from two different perspectives help shape the advice that you give today?
Yeah, Aaron, well, first of all, thanks for having me on the pod. I'm often the person giving the questions. It's nice receiving the questions for a change. I'd like to say I've been on both sides of the podium. When you're a reporter, your job is really to be skeptical, and that's kind of in my nature to be skeptical, yet also optimistic. I hope for the best, but I also plan for the worst. And I think as a journalist, that serves you well to, if a company puts out a press release of saying, we're creating a perfect future of sustainable growth, like I'm going to be questioning that. So when I started my career, this was almost 20 years ago. So it was a very different era of corporate sustainability. So this would have been around right around 2010-ish to probably 2010 to 2015 was when you saw lots of companies putting out more of like fluffy press releases around, sustainability goals. And I know we're going to get more into this later, but there wasn't really a lot of methodology around what they were doing. And because honestly, a lot of them probably were just making up numbers that sounded good. At the time, I was kind of still learning about this space. I think at first I would believe them, but then as I dug deeper, I'd have more questions of like, okay, well, what is this? Like, what are you actually trying to achieve? Okay, great, you set carbon reduction goals, but like, what does this actually mean for your actual business and like in absolute terms and things like that? And then a couple of years later, when I shifted over to more of the consulting side, the reason I did that too is because I felt like I could have more impact kind of working with companies directly. So, as a reporter, it's great. I mean, I love that. I love being able to just kind of write about every single industry from food to apparel, tech, whatever. But I always felt like I was kind of just reporting what was being told to me. And so when I was at Edelman, I was working with some companies like the North Face and Kashi and HP and some others where I really got to help them figure out, okay, like this is what our strategy is. Here's what we're actually doing. How do we translate this to our different stakeholder audiences? And I talk a lot about this in my book. My book just came out, Sustainability Storytelling. It's available May 3rd in UK and Canada, May 26th in the US and globally. And I wrote this book really to kind of address that problem of companies struggling to tell authentic stories that actually advance progress. Because I think what we've seen in recent years is we kind of know what we need to do more or less, especially in the decarbonization front. Like that, the science is pretty clear. The problem is that we don't do it. Companies don't act on it. Stakeholders don't act on it. And I do get into this in the book where it's really not about information. It's about motivation. And, you can get all the information and data in the world, but still not act on it, which is what's happening every day in corporate boardrooms.
Well, that's a perfect segue to the next question because I wanted to ask you in your book, I think one of the things that's very useful is you focus on sustainability communication
Mhm.
principles.
Yeah.
And I think that framework is very helpful for people who haven't thought about this
Mhm.
as much to think about how to adapt sustainability communications so they can be credible, authentic, and engaging. And typically, we talk about the goal being how to both avoid greenwashing, but also not fall into the trap of green hushing, where
Mhm.
companies are too cautious to share real world wins. I wanted to ask with these sustainability communication principles, if you can talk about those topics broadly, and then specifically how they might relate to more technical
Mhm.
topics like carbon accounting and decarbonization progress.
So the reason I wrote this book is because I've noticed a challenge just throughout my career is like I'm kind of I'm not going to call myself a unicorn, but my background is unusual where I'm not quite a technical person, but I'm not also just a comms person either. I could sit in a net zero meeting with sustainability people and contribute and understand just as much as I could in a PR meeting or a crisis communications Zoom or something with executives. And so generally at big companies, you've got your sustainability teams that are you tend to be more technical focused, who, everybody knows how to write. Obviously, we learn how to write, but they're not necessarily communicators as their first love. And then you have your kind of corporate comms people who might be great communicators more generally, but they're not in the weeds on sustainability. So, I mean, as you know, I'm like every 6 months that things are changing. Not even every month, I feel things are changing in sustainability. And so being that person that kind of sits between those two, that's been kind of my niche even as a consultant is, company will bring me in. They might have a comms team that, has some experience in sustainability, but not a ton. And then their sustainability team that's not super nuanced on communications. And I kind of, translate between the two. So for the book, I was trying to think about, what are kind of the main problems that I see as when companies try to communicate sustainability, and how can I put this into kind of a more of a like a usable framework, because there's a million posts out on LinkedIn and elsewhere about like, oh, you gotta tell stories that are engaging and emotional and whatnot, but like what does that actually mean? Like that's very vague. And so I came up with a framework that anybody could use. It's designed to be used by anybody, a sustainability person, a comms person, called the 4 C's of effective sustainability storytelling. And I'll just kind of briefly walk you through each one of those now. So the first is context, and this is, I call it the silent C. So this is something that I think a lot of people don't think about when they're communicating sustainability, is like you're not communicating into a vacuum, right? Like, if you're a global company and you're communicating net zero goals in San Francisco, that's going to hit different than maybe in, rural Alabama. This podcast is more focused on the E, but if you're talking about social issues like DEI is going to be received very differently in Russia than it is, somewhere else. And so being aware of the cultural context and kind of those factors of like where your message is going to be received is really important for how you shape them. Part of context is kind of reputation, right? So industry reputation is a great example. So let's say you're a plastics company in the plastics industry. Stakeholders might already have assumptions about your industry being dirty or whatnot. And so, when you communicate something, even if it's in good faith, you might have some skepticism. So just being aware of that and framing your narrative accordingly. There's also this idea called the halo effect, which I talk about in the book, which I didn't come up with the concept. It's a well-known concept, but if there's perceptions that your industry is good, quote unquote, you might have some leeway. So a good example of this is, for the longest time, kind of the tech sector, especially the Silicon Valley tech sector, had this halo effect where they were perceived as being inherently good for the world, and a lot of that might have been a lot of the good marketing they had about we're saving the world through our SaaS solutions or whatever. It's interesting because now, in the last couple of years, I think tech has kind of soured on a lot of people, so now they're kind of going the other direction. But there were years and years where a lot of these tech companies were doing absolutely nothing to advance. Companies like Salesforce and others and Google, they're doing a lot of great work, but a lot of these companies might have just been writing that perception of being inherently good. But then once stakeholders realize, like, oh wait, like they're not doing anything, that when there's that disconnect, that's going to hurt your reputation. So that's context. And then compelling, when I think about compelling, I try to go beyond like comms is not just about spin or making things sound good. Like that's kind of, I think, the assumption for, especially for a lot of technical people, is that it's like, making it fluffy or making it somehow less uh, like credible, but making it sound good. But to me, compelling is really about thinking about how the human brain actually works and how people like what makes people care about things and how do you reach that? So like human psychology and also the media environment that we're in, which is incredibly fragmented today, where, again, you put out a message around sustainability. It's not just magically getting from point A to point B. Like it gets refracted through, tons of different media outlets, social media outlets, and it's reinterpreted each time so that, you might put out a clean message, but by the time it gets to a certain person, it's completely not what you said. These are things that you don't necessarily have control over, but it's just things you have to factor in when you're communicating. So when you're talking about technical audiences, we're doing X, Y, and Z to address our scope 3 emissions. Why does this matter to somebody? Or if you're talking to the CFO, they want to know, how is this financially material to our business? I do talk about this in the book too. One of the key traits of a good sustainability communicator is empathy and kind of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and really think about like how do they view the world? What do they care about? And particularly what are their incentives? Because I think that's another issue too, generally across our economy is the incentives are all off for advancing sustainability. And that's, we obviously can't single-handedly address all those systemic problems, but from a company level, and I think a big problem that a lot of us folk fall into is because we care so much about this, and our job is to think about 50 years into the future, but the average person at your company, they're thinking about the next 6 months or the next year. And so if you come in at it like you should care about climate change because it's important, and like people are going to be turned off instantly, because even if they do care, like that their job is to focus on these quarterly goals, right? And I'll quickly go through the other two. So then there's credible and compliant. So credible is simply, this is the realm of sustainability people, which is just making sure that like, especially like in carbon accounting, making sure that your data is accurate, making sure that you're actually doing what you're talking about, that your methodology is documented and your data is verifiable and your claims are scoped correctly. And then compliance, the one that's probably been top of mind for most companies lately, which is making sure that you're not greenwashing, that you're meeting increasingly complex and rigid regulatory requirements. In terms of carbon accounting, I think one thing that's been really top of mind, and I talk about like this in the book too, is carbon neutrality and like making those claims. We're kind of getting to a point where carbon neutral is kind of out as the term, because it's, there's been tons of lawsuits around, companies that have claimed carbon neutrality in their products. And then, the methodology wasn't clear. And so consumers were able to sue them. And a lot of times they've been thrown out, but it just, creates a lot of a headache. And even net zero is starting to kind of fall under similar scrutiny. So again, it doesn't mean don't try to decarbonize, but it just means don't try to get ahead of yourself.
Mike, thank you for walking us through that. And I think that is a great preview of the book and why it's worth diving in deeper. I think just as a reminder for the audience, I want to zoom back out and just highlight those four key frames were context, compelling, credible, and compliance. And I do want to then zoom in and ask if you can help give us an example where you think you've seen the communication done right.
Hmm.
So, particularly since we're focused on emissions and decarbonization, obviously
Hmm.
there is a lot of variation in what companies are trying to do and how they've communicated. But do you have any examples that you'd highlight where you'd say, yes, this is a great example of a company communicating on carbon, on emissions or decarbonization in a way that meets those criteria or comes off to you as good communication?
Yeah, I mean, the best example that I have right now is a pretty current one. PepsiCo last year, actually, my friend Dan Estreche, he kind of leads their sustainability comms there, and I interviewed him for my book too. So PepsiCo, they put out proactive communication, basically announcing that they weren't going to be hitting some of their 2030 goals. A lot of them were climate and packaging goals. And so the rationale for why they were expecting not to hit their 2030 goals, a lot of it was really out of their control. So it's like public policy related stuff. So it's like a lot of these goals were made in around 2020-ish, and 2020 was a very different. It's crazy that was only 6 years ago, but in 2020, we really felt sustainability was kind of on the upswing. BlackRock was equating climate risk with investment risk. Companies were really speaking out, saying, we're gonna achieve net zero by 2050. Even in the policy arena, it felt like there was a lot of momentum in Europe and even in the US at the time that this was inevitable. And so a lot of companies made goals assuming that this trend was going to continue. From a high level though, and we're not going to get into politics today, but it's not in the US, like things are going not the way we expected or we hoped on that front, especially where we are today in the past year. The federal government is actively fighting against this now, which is, who would have thought, like 10 years ago, you never would have thought that would have happened. So that creates a lot of compounding effects. Not only is the federal government, not investing in this, but they're actively trying to attack it now. Like that creates headwinds that are hard to overcome. But that's only part of the equation. I think some companies are trying to kind of hide behind that, saying, oh, it's not our fault. But going back to the original question about why Pepsi is doing a good job. So I think the way that they approached it was they knew that, especially being Pepsi, they're a very high profile company. And so they were like, all right, well, we could make this really difficult for people to, like, and I think Dan called it an Easter egg hunt. Like, we could just bury this in our sustainability report and like hope nobody notices and make it really hard and just not talk about it. But they took another approach and they were like, all right, we're going to just get ahead of this. And he actually told me that they went after their biggest critic was, I don't know the exact reporter's name, but there's a Wall Street Journal reporter that I guess covers their beat. And they actually just reached out to this reporter and had an open conversation with them about, okay, here's what's happening, here's what we're doing. We're kind of recalibrating our goals to be more realistic. I mean, this is really how sustainability should be. Like you need to adapt as you're going, because nobody's ever done this before. Like nobody's ever decarbonized the planet before, right? So you can't assume that you set goals and a strategy, they're just going to be perfect, right? So you have to figure out, you have to bake it into that, like we're going to change it. That being said, though, that doesn't give a company license to just like, we didn't invest enough, or we didn't do, like they don't really care about it. Like they want to be perceived as caring but aren't doing enough, but then are saying that it's not their fault. So there's a balance there, right? Because so much of this is black box. Like we don't all work at these companies, we don't know if they actually did try or not. And so with Pepsi, I think what I really respect about their approach was just, they kind of showed their homework, and they talked about their methodology, and here's what we're doing, this is how we're recalibrating to make sure we're having the impact we want to have.
Well, thank you for sharing that example. I think it's a very interesting one, and talks about kind of directly engaging. I like that idea about not hiding in an Easter egg, and just being very forthright about it, and also kind of engaging. I don't know if critics is the right word, but really like inviting people who would be skeptical to be part of that, because I think
Hmm.
that actually makes it feel very credible. I want to double back to the 2030 conversation in a minute, but first, I wanted to ask a different framing question around GHG communication, because I think that there's oftentimes, in my view, three distinct challenges with communicating. Some of that
Hmm.
have different timescales.
Hmm.
So, one is reporting current emissions. And I think that's hard because you're translating a very complex accounting process, usually into concise messaging and bullet points. Two is communicating emission reduction goals, which are usually kind of more future focused. And that's taking what's oftentimes a voluntary pledge, but has real reputational risk. And so, just when we think about reporting emissions, communicating kind of goals, and then reporting progress, those each are a little different. And I was curious if you see companies getting into more trouble in one of those categories than the other, or if there's any high level thoughts you would have about reporting current emissions, reporting goals, and then reporting progress.
We have to understand that the average consumer has no clue what carbon accounting even means. I think this is where, like, again, sustainability communicator like myself can help, because like I'm not somebody who does carbon accounting, but I can look at the results of a project and understand them. But the average person, if you were to show them like a PowerPoint talking about carbon accounting, they'd be like, "Wait, what? Like you can count carbon?" And this is the challenge, right? I think a lot of companies, when they're talking about carbon for the longest time, were being too fluffy and too vague about it, and so that's also creates greenwashing risk, right? Like, you see a lot of this language is now being hopefully refined, but the early days of communicating on climate, you'd see these vague claims on companies' websites and their reports that are like, we're committing to decarbonizing our supply chain. Okay, but what the heck does that mean? So that's like the extreme of being too vague. But then if you get, into the weeds of like, this decimal point is here because of this, like you're going to lose people too. But again, it depends on who your audience is. So like if you're trying to communicate to ESG raters, like, yeah, they're going to want to know the decimal point stuff. Like that's really important. And even your investors, I mean, most of your investors are not going to care about that level of detail. So I think one of the most effective approaches, instead of like addressing each of these stages of carbon counting, I think I'll just say like the general approach to addressing all these is to make sure there's layers. So it's layers of communication, right? So let's say on your website, your highest level would be kind of the most, would never use the term vague, but like accessible language. So like, talking about your climate action strategy, your commitment, tying it back to your corporate values and why you're doing this. And then maybe, if you have like, here's the 3 areas where we have the most carbon intensity, and this is what how we're addressing it. And then have, click here to learn more. And then you can kind of go deeper. So if you want to go like, okay, here's the data behind what we're doing. Here's the methodology behind our goals. So you can kind of like, everyone that wants to get deeper can get deeper. And that also backs you up, because then if someone sues you for greenwashing, you can say, hey, look, we showed our work. Here's what we're doing. So I think that one of the reasons why this often doesn't happen is because who's responsible for putting this communication out? It's often the comms team who owns the website, and they don't really understand the risk. I mean, not always. They're not making generalizations, but on average, the most common corporate communicator at a company, they're not in the weeds here. So they might not even realize like, oh man, like having a decimal point in the wrong place could get us in trouble. Like, so that's also sort of on the sustainability team to develop that relationship with the comms people to help them understand that. But I talk about this in the book too, about creating this cross-functional collaboration where you both kind of develop respect for each other and understand, like, this is maybe your lane and my lane, but we have to work together on this to make sure we get there. But when it comes to reporting current emissions, I mean, like, that's also really complicated, right? Because again, especially in the US, this is still voluntary technically, except in certain jurisdictions. So until there's like the government says this is the exact framework you have to use. Like, GHG protocol is the most common one, but that's, unless that's the law saying that you have to do this, it's sometimes vague. And even when you are reporting through these frameworks, so much of this is self-reported, right? You're sifting through utility bills or other things where it's just like, I've worked with some companies that, I'm not going to say which, but like, you'd think they would have had all this information figured out, and they don't. And like, they couldn't even tell you, like, because they're so global in scope that like, it's really hard for them to get some of this data. So the data cleanliness is also a big issue, and reliability. And so how do you communicate that? Well, I would say before you communicate anything, make sure that you you have that stuff figured out. So here's our methodology, and this is where you also need to work with your legal team. And they're a huge pillar here too. Like, they can help you understand, like, all right, like, if we put this out, is this going to withstand scrutiny? Like, if we get sued for greenwashing, do we have enough data here proving this claim? So it's really not that complicated. You make a claim, back it up. At the end of the day, the first goal is that this just makes good business sense, and we're trying to build resilient businesses that are going to be able to thrive indefinitely. So getting away from that, like, this is not corporate philanthropy mindset, is really hard sometimes. And I think that's also where anyone that reads my book will learn this. So if you're at a company where the sustainability person, it's like all on them, kind of like approach your comms team to kind of help them learn, and don't just be like, oh, they're just here to make things fluffy. Respect what their expertise is, and kind of help them understand, how you can leverage their skills to create stronger claims and communication that are just going to help everybody. And then finally, reduction goals. It's funny. I feel like nobody's talking about goals anymore because they're afraid that they're not going to hit them. But yeah, this was a big thing. Like, I guess 5 years ago, I had a lot of clients at the time that were, they wanted to set goals, because this was right around when Larry Fink's letter came out to CEOs. A lot of companies that hadn't set goals were getting pressure from their boards to do so, and a lot of these companies didn't want to do the actual work to actually create science-based targets at the time. And I know, although the science-based targets initiative is still growing, which is great. I have some data in my book about that. But there were a lot of companies too that were just kind of like, oh, this sounds right. Like, it wasn't very,
Just throw a dart at the wall.
exactly. And, okay, we'll just say 20%, but like 20% of what? Like, what does that even mean? And very few of them were willing to commit to scope 3, which is where, night was at 90% plus of emissions take place.
I usually say 70 to 90%,
Right.
depending on the business.
Yeah, so a significant amount. And basically, it's like, well, then if you're not going to talk about scope 3, does this even matter? Right? Like, I talk about scopes in my book, and I don't dumb it down, but I bring it down to a level where, like, if you had no idea what a scope was, I explain it. Like, your consumers don't know what scope emissions are. Like, they barely know what carbon emissions really are. And so how do you talk about this vague like supply chain, and even supply chain is, these are, it's all corporate lingo. The average person has no idea what we're talking about. So again, it's knowing your audience and thinking about like making sure that you're translating this into language that the people you're trying to reach will understand. And I think in sustainability world, we tend to have over reliance on buzzwords because they are they're mental shortcuts that are used there. It's called a heuristic. So it basically, it makes it easier for people to remember, but it also oversimplifies. And then talking about reporting progress against goals. I mean, we kind of talked about this the Pepsi thing, but I think this is also where it's challenging because, um, like this is, like I said earlier, this work has never been done before. Nobody's ever successfully solved climate change. So every company is technically failing at this right now, even if they're achieving their actual goals. And so how do you kind of tell a narrative like, all right, we're doing our best, but we're falling behind or we're moving ahead. But there's also macro factors, right? Like, okay, yeah, if there's a down, like during COVID, a bunch of emissions went down because people weren't doing business and were traveling. And but
Right.
then your business grows, you're gonna have carbon go up. Um, so again, I think it comes back to just showing your work, being as transparent as possible, and just being willing to talk about failure. Like, and as long as you're doing it in good faith, because again, there's lots of companies that might spin it as, oh, we tried or did our best, but we couldn't do it. In order to know the ones that are truly trying and the ones that aren't, is like showing your work. So like, okay, great. Like, you can't just say, we missed our goals, too bad. Like, a company that I would respect would be like, hey, here's all the things we did. We're investing all this, these resources to these goals to address them. Here's why we didn't achieve them. Here's what we learned, and here's how we're going to do better. That would honestly be a better story that would actually show that they're trying, that they care.
So there's a lot to what you just said. I'd
Yeah,
love to unpack all of it, but I
yeah,
think I did want to use this as a bridge to specifically doubling back to something that you mentioned
hmm,
before this question, which is about 2030.
hmm,
And I was really taken by Solitaire Townsend. She had written in Trellis recently that we're headed towards a net zero mass failure. And I just think the way that she used that
hmm,
was really galvanizing for me for realizing what's happening with many of these companies that, as you said, made very ambitious commitments, particularly around 2020. They made commitments that involve scope three, and scope three progress depends on societal decarbonization that they haven't always seen. I mean, I think many companies are
hmm,
struggling with this.
hmm,
So I wanted to specifically get your sense on this from a communication standpoint. 2030 feels like it's around the corner. And I've had a lot of personal reflections on this issue because I think that there are a lot of actions that we need to take that are actually about decarbonization, and that we need to take collectively, right? Where we want companies to take responsibility, but they can't solely take responsibility for things that are
hmm,
a societal level
hmm,
initiative. But when we think about this through a communications lens, and I think you've been alluding to a lot of this, both with Pepsi and then in your last answer, where some companies are struggling how to communicate on this. Some companies might be using this as cover where they actually
hmm,
haven't put in the work. But what would be your advice to companies to communicate this reality about
hmm,
these 2030 goals, which many people are going to have a hard time meeting? Um, and communicate about it without it becoming a credibility crisis, because I think credibility is also a key part of your framework. And
hmm,
if people said that they're going to do something by 2030 and it doesn't happen, it feels like that could undermine a lot of momentum on sustainability
hmm.
if people don't believe that there's work that's really happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Saltaire beat me to it. I was actually thinking about writing a similar article because I think she articulated what a lot of us kind of knew was happening. This came up in a couple conversations, I believe at GreenBiz this year, or even the year before, where like we're probably not going to, like, most of these 2030 goals are like not going to happen. And there's so much complexity to this. Like even right now, like where we are in this political environment in the US, right? Like I'm hearing anecdotal stories from people who work at, most of them are like the mid-market companies, not the huge Fortune 500s, but where they just assume that sustainability is dead in the US. And like I know a couple people that are losing their jobs because of this, because there were some companies that they created an ESG team, sustainability team, around 2020, and they thought that the US was kind of heading towards this more highly regulated environment. And now they just think that, okay, Trump came in, everything, yeah, we're done. And I think they're wrong because the pendulum is going to swing back. Like we're already seeing this. Like and again, I'm not going to get too into politics, but like it, we're going to see with the midterms a huge wave going the other direction. It's pretty clear. And then like we're going to come back in a couple years where this is all going to be back on the agenda again. And the companies that have like backtracked are going to, but their credibility is going to be completely shot because they're going to be like, when we had the opportunity to stand our ground, we just said screw it and backed off. The companies that stand their ground they're going to actually look legit because like, whether you actually are committed to something, it's easy when things are good and things are in your favor. True principles really come out when it's maybe not as easy. And I think with net zero, I mean, I've even been hearing people saying we should retire the term, but I mean, that's another, buzzword that again, the average person doesn't get. But the way I think about it is like, I think goals are important and keep us on track, but there's been overemphasis on like if 2050, if we don't hit by the Paris Agreement, things like that, we don't hit these goals by 2050, the world is in trouble. But I mean, realistically, like I don't think we're going to hit the best case scenario of that, but every degree of warming and avoiding it matters. And so that doesn't mean just like screw it, goals don't matter, but I think also this happened. I write about this in my book a little bit too, is like we try to create the sense of urgency, like even with 2030 goals, right? Like, okay, we got to do this by 2030 or else, 2030 is going to come and the world is going to continue on, right? It's not going to end on 2030 if these goals aren't met. And what that creates problems is then all of a sudden people who have been told like, if it's so important for the survival of humanity to meet these goals and then life goes on, that kind of reduces that urgency next time, right? And again, it doesn't mean don't have goals, but I think this is also why we need to get away from like do this now or we're all dead, because climate change, even in the worst case scenario, like we're all going to be long dead before the worst impacts happen. That doesn't mean don't care. This is why I love communication, because it is this mass psychology and communications challenge of how do you balance, like you don't want to be what's called a climate doomer, which is basically like we're all dead if we don't do this. But then there's also the opposite side of the spectrum, which is the bright siderism, which has been often the kind of the corporate approach of like we can solve it through human ingenuity, and like that's kind of too positive. And so it's like, how do you balance realities of what we have to do this work now with the world's not going to blow up in 2050 if we miss these goals. And this is also the problem with climate, right? Is that it's a very slow burn. So literally, so like even now, like, I mean, when I was a kid, California wasn't on fire every summer and now it is. So anyway, back to the original question around net zero reckoning, like, and this also makes me think a lot about like the SDGs, right? Like those are all not being met. Nobody's meeting those goals. And so how do you balance a mechanism for accountability and progress with knowing like we're going to miss them? In? I think it comes back to how do you translate the science better? So like obviously the Science-Based Targets Initiative does a good job at this, but like how do we help people understand like, okay, like they need to meet these goals, but okay, if they don't, if they get 90% of the way there, that's good too.
Hearing you talk is actually reminding me just of the book All We Can Save. And I think
Oh
just
yeah.
the book title alone does a really good job of acknowledging we're in a climate crisis, but it's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. There's
Mm-hmm.
damage that's going to happen. Every tenth of a degree matters,
Yeah.
but thinking that we're going to hit the perfect outcome is
Yeah.
also not realistic. And I think we want to avoid ending up in a Chicken Little situation where we lose credibility. Before, when you were talking about layers and these layers of communication, I think that actually lends into a lot of people listening to this podcast. It's on carbon accounting. We're very in the weeds. How do we translate carbon data for a non technical audience? Because I think we need to be able to think in terms
Mhm.
of those layers where we, a lot of people doing carbon accounting, may be thinking about emissions factors, activity data,
Yeah.
material thresholds, all of the things that make up an inventory and really focusing on that credibility. But how do we zoom out and explain those results to a CFO, a board, a marketing team?
Yeah.
And I think your framework here really helps to take complex carbon data and turn it into messaging that's easier to understand and really also drives action.
This is not just a carbon accounting problem. Like every sustainability challenge is difficult to communicate, right? And even the non-technical ones. One exercise that I've learned that's helped me as a communicator is how do you explain, like if you have children or if you have like children in your life, try explaining it, start with them, right? Like, how would you explain this to a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old? It doesn't mean dumb it down, but like, how would you simplify this so much that a 5-year-old would at least kind of get it? And then, okay, so we started there. Okay, so now my 5-year-old gets it. How if an eighth grader, if I was explaining to an eighth grader. And here's another thing, that we forget, and if we're focusing on the United States, the average American reads at an eighth grade level or something like that. Or like, this is also, again, getting into politics, but a lot of politicians that kind of water down their rhetoric to like simplify it, it works better. Like, the average American is not educated enough to get very complex stuff. And again, we're not, this is if you're talking to the general audience. Generally, if you're talking to investors, they're educated, they're more educated. But I would say always start with, what's the most simplest way I could explain this without it being meaningless? If I'm going to my board, and also this is another issue for a lot of companies, I talk about this in the book, board education around these issues is horrible at most companies. Like, most boards self-report like have not getting ESG, but still being responsible for making decisions about it. And again, this is beyond just straight up communications. It's also, we come at everything with our own biases, right? So like, we're all consuming certain news or certain information framed in a certain way where, if I'm a board member and I'm watching Fox News all day, I might come at this, we're like, oh, climate change is a hoax, I don't care. Like, so how do you get them to care when that's hard, overcoming that programming? But you can start at, okay, here's the numbers, like, hey, like last year extreme weather events like caused X amount of dollars of damage in our supply chain. And you don't even have to say climate, just like you could literally say hurricanes when whatever country did this, or delays because of, that it was so hot that our workers couldn't work. It's kind of like, I talk about the movie Fight Club a lot with climate comms. Like, don't talk about Fight Club as the rule of Fight Club. The best sustainability communicators don't have to say sustainability, don't have to say climate, don't use the buzzwords. So when you're, if you're a carbon accounting person, I would say, think about how a non-technical brain works. I'm not saying people that are technical aren't creative, but like, most people are not questioning every single underlying claim and not necessarily adding the numbers up in their head. They're trying to take shortcuts to the solution. So thinking about like, okay, if I'm trying to get like my main point across around this, instead of just throwing a bunch of data at them, how can I synthesize this in a way that will actually matter to them? Still have the data available in case someone wants to look at it, but understand that if you're talking to like a building engineer and they're explaining to you how the building works for the technical level, the average person is going to be lost if you start explaining how the HVAC works. And so again, knowing your audience, like maybe one of your investors has a technical background, then you can get more detailed on it. That goes back to the layers thing.
So I want to add one other nuance to
Yeah.
this, and I love where you're taking this. But for people that are thinking about how to do this GHG accounting in a technical way, one other element is we think about some of the uncertainty, right? I think a lot of GHG accounting, it's either measuring or modeling invisible gases. And within an inventory, there's assumptions, estimates, emission factors that are going to be changed. And so it does feel like it's good for us to talk about uncertainty. But if we talk about uncertainty, again, does that reduce credibility in what we're trying to communicate? And so I wasn't sure, similar to talking about how to engage a non
Yeah.
technical audience, if there's any other nuance that you would add there about how to talk about
Yeah.
uncertainty, because the process is evolving as we know
Yeah.
more. And that's just the nature of GHG accounting.
The problem with science communication in general is that we're at a disadvantage when we're communicating scientific topics like climate change, because it's based off of uncertainty. Like with climate change, you could say it's like, 98% of scientists agree that the planet is warming and humans are to blame. But somebody might say, whoa, well, that's not 100%. So there's questions about it. I think this is a bigger issue with our education system of just like scientific literacy is so low in our country that like, I'm not a scientist. I mean, I went to school in college and grad school, but like I trust scientists. And if 98% of scientists say they agree with something, like I'm going to agree with them. So so humans, we want the world to be ordered, right? Like people forget that, humans, we've been around for maybe 300,000 years or so. Our brains are not any different than 300,000 years ago, really. Like we evolved to deal with immediate threats like that tiger's charging me. I got to fight or I got to run, or, hey, I got to, get enough food to survive the winter. This idea that like, okay, like billions of little actions of like, I'm driving my kid to school and then I got to go to work. Me driving that fossil fuel powered car is contributing to the downfall of humanity. Like it's so hard for us to draw those connections because it's also all of us have generally as individuals have such a minuscule impact. This is also why I'm a big proponent of like, like it's systemic. It's like individual actions really don't matter that much, in my opinion. This whole idea of like, I'm vegan, so I'm saving the world. Like, great, fine, be vegan if you want to be vegan. But like, I eat meat. Like, I don't eat it every day, but like, I drive a gas powered car. I might actually just bought a hybrid, but like, it's what I do as an individual really means nothing. Most of the missions in this world come from large corporations, and a lot of it's based off incentives that is set by public policy. So if you're trying to communicate to your investors why it's important to decarbonize, you just got to make it understandable to them. And this is also one of the challenges that I do raise in my book a little bit. If we're still in a shareholder supremacy era of like, maximizing shareholder profit is seen as like it's the legal requirement, but it's also kind of what's been accepted. But we forget that wasn't always the case in the US. Like, that concept of stakeholder capitalism, that other stakeholders matter in addition to shareholders, like that is the world that we could have. But I mean, we currently don't live in that world, which is, again, as individuals, as the guy counting carbon at a corporation, you don't have the power to change that. But we have to keep in mind that we're working within an imperfect system, and like, we can do what we can to create, change at scale. But like, we're still trying to kind of put like a square peg in a circle hole, right? It doesn't mean it's all a bunch of BS, but it's also like we're dealing in it in a very messy, complicated landscape where, yeah, at the end of the day, like if an exec was making decisions on 50 years in the future, this would be easy. It totally makes sense, but they're not. And so when you can't change that.
I love that example of that executive. And I think that's going to transition for me into talking about different audiences that we might be trying to reach.
Mhm.
Typically, when I think about communication, I'm thinking about external stakeholders and the general public. But in my experience, sustainability leaders are also communicating topics, progress, and updates to internal leaders and stakeholders within the company, which can be their executive team,
Mhm.
company leadership, the general employee base. And oftentimes I find that sustainability teams, they need to influence decisions where they may not have full ownership over the outcome. They can influence it, but there's a lot of other cooks in the kitchen. So I wanted to ask if you see internal communication in any way different from external communication. And for a lot of sustainability teams, if there's specific communication principles like the one that you've outlined that you think are especially worth highlighting for internal communication.
Yeah, you can't really communicate externally until you've done it internally. And internal comms, especially if you're dealing with execs, is like convincing them to continue to invest in resources into your sustainability goals, right? And I found some interesting data actually. And I have a chapter on making the business case for sustainability, and there's been a couple surveys in the last couple years that show that most CEOs at big companies actually claim that they understand why sustainability matters and why it makes business sense. Even CFOs, there's like a CFO survey from last year that I included in the book that like majority of CFOs understand the business opportunity of sustainability. And that's sustainability writ large, like not just carbon. But then they also report in the same survey that they see it as a cost center. This is where human psychology comes into play, right? Like you can hold two opposing ideas at the same time, right? So they see it as an opportunity and at a cost. And same with this with the CEOs who they surveyed, they still report like getting it. So this is what I find fascinating is like there's this whole idea in especially in US focused sustainability, like I got to keep making the case for sustainability. If only I explained it better or gave them more data, they would understand and prioritize it. We've succeeded. Like there's enough data now. Most companies, I mean, it's not the business case isn't always super clear, but even when it is super clear, it's still hard for CEOs to prioritize it because there's other things that are like again, they're prioritized for short term profits. Right now, you see all these companies investing in AI, even though it's still unclear if it's going to pay off. Did you hear that like Allbirds is rebranding as an AI company? Like
I
things, it's
did.
crazy. Everybody's calling them like the opportunity if they get it right and if they win is huge, so huge that they're like we can't miss this opportunity. Versus decarbonization is so clearly just good for your business, but it's like it's kind of difference between like investing in your index fund or like going to Vegas and putting all in black. And I think our execs tend to they'd rather go to Vegas and win big than like I'm just going to put this in index funds and then make more money, $2 million over the next 50 years or something.
I love that
Yeah,
analogy though, in
yeah.
terms of thinking about risk versus reward and how we communicate internally and also how people make decisions. Um, Mike, this conversation's been fascinating, but I wanted to bring us now to the
Hmm.
implementation minute and really talk about takeaways that our listeners can glean from all of this.
Hmm.
So I wanted you to imagine that it's Monday morning, a sustainability leader just finished listening to this episode. What's one thing they should do when they get to their desk? Something that takes 30 minutes or less that meaningfully improves how they communicate on sustainability.
This is what I tell everybody right now. Don't worry about like the strategy right now. What you could do right now is get an email going between your legal team, your comms team, and your sustainability team, and say, hey, I want us to get together next Tuesday. Well, if we have never met before, let's get to know each other. And then if we have, like, I want to sit through, like, what are, sustainability? What are your sustainability goals for the year? Like, what are things that are going to be missed? Or what are things that you're excited about? Legal, like, what is this? How does this impact our exposure? And then communications, like, what's on your agenda for this year? Like, what are you announcing? Or like, both internally and externally, and start building that rapport now, because I think that is honestly the number one way any company can do better, is building that cross-functional collaboration before you need it, right? So this happens all the time. Like, I do a lot of sustainability reports. Companies hire me as the consultant to help them do this. These teams are so focused on like what's like their next objective that it's hard for them to think long term. And so they might be like, they wait until the report's halfway done before they bring legal in or comms in. And it's very transactional, like, hey, legal, can you check this to make sure it's okay? Building this understanding about what everyone's focused on, and like how they look at it, because it is a tug of war, right? And this goes back to my 4 C's of communications. Generally want the stories to be compelling, and also they want to protect the brand. And sustainability wants it to be credible, so they're focused on making sure everything's credible. And then compliance is the realm of legal, so making sure that you kind of get it together now, kind of build that understanding, that mutual trust and respect. That's going to make it a million times easier when you have to put out your next net zero announcement, or like instead of just bringing them in to just get the project done, like having more of a long term uh, uh, relationship. And then that'll also allow you to develop a strategy instead of just being one off. Like, all right, it's Earth Day. Like, what are we going to talk about? I call it sustainability communication strategy in place. And then you have all the players that are going to be involved. Long story short, get to know your teams, build those cross-functional relationships. And if you're physically in an office, maybe like say, hey, let's have a lunch meeting and just talk it out, and then build that as a foundation.
I think that's fantastic advice. I wanted to also ask if there's a resource that you'd recommend, whether from your own work, your upcoming book, or something else that shaped how you think about communicating complex environmental data that you'd recommend to our listeners.
Well, definitely read my book, because I literally wrote this book to be this resource that didn't exist that I wish I'd had and other companies had. LinkedIn, honestly, is a really good resource. I get a lot of my ideas just following others on LinkedIn who, have different focus areas. Like Aaron, like when you post things specifically to your field of expertise, because like I don't spend all day thinking about carbon accounting, but you do. So it's good for me to read your stuff and kind of be like, okay, I don't need to like know every little thing, but he's helping me think about or listen to this podcast. And I think that's why I love about sustainability is we're talking about how do we rebuild society in a way that works for everybody and allows us to keep doing this indefinitely. Like there's so many entry points. Like you can be a carbon guy. I'm a comms person. Like there's so many ways to tackle this. And again, you don't have to be on top of every topic, but I think LinkedIn for me, it's like I can literally just open it up and just be like, oh, okay, like that's happened. I want to learn more about that, or that person has interesting insights. Then also, I would say if you can make it to like a in-person event, GreenBiz can be hard for people sometimes because it's expensive, but or other conferences. But if you can swing going to an in-person event once in a while, like I learned so much by the like during cocktail hours, honestly, just when people have the real talk, because then they're willing to actually tell you what's going on versus like the scrubbed version that's on the main stage. So that also comes back to just build, I call it net learning. So like networking and is learning at the same time. So like even on LinkedIn, like you can reach out to somebody who you want to learn from, and not everyone can take an informational interview these days, but you have something to learn from everybody. And if you treat it that way, like like even an intern can teach you something. Like I learned now when I talk to like lower level people at companies, like I learn a lot about like how does the next generation think, for example, and that helps me too. And so if you treat every interaction and everything as a learning experience, like that's going to make you a better sustainability professional too, because this is changing with every day. And And I think that's how I've stayed on top of it, is just by constantly learning. And I love that. Not everybody likes that. Some people want to be like, I learned this skill set and I'm just going to do this for 40 years, but that's not sustainability. So
Yeah. I definitely agree that continuous learning is what it
yeah,
takes to be successful in this field. And I thought I'd just share, I'm actually going to a networking event today that is on a train. So we'll be traveling
that is
up
amazing.
and down and collecting people and kind
Oh,
of having a sustainability networking hours. This has been a fabulous conversation. Before we wrap, I want to give a quick thank you to North Star Carbon and Impact for supporting this podcast. If you're looking for an easier, more transparent way to manage carbon and ESG data and prepare for audits, reporting, and decarbonization planning, please visit northstarcarbon.com to learn more or request a demo. Mike, where can listeners connect with you, find the Sustainability Communicator, and order your book, Sustainability Storytelling?
thank you so much for having me. I hope everybody got some out of this today. And I'll just also say, follow me on LinkedIn, listen to my podcast and my newsletter. It's all about this stuff. So there's always ways to improve.
And for your book, should they go to your website or is there anywhere else where we should be looking for your book?
It's available anywhere books are sold. You can go on Amazon and just look up sustainability storytelling. I have a link on my webpage. If you're somebody that doesn't like Amazon, you can go directly to the publisher Kogan Page. If you just Google sustainability storytelling Kogan Page, you can find it. But I think it's available pretty much wherever. And again, you can pre-order it now. It's also available on ebook. So
Great. Well,
yeah.
Mike, thank you again. For all of our listeners, I want to say thanks for listening. And if this episode was valuable, please share your biggest takeaway on LinkedIn and tag us so we can continue the conversation there. Thanks for listening.